Please welcome back to the stage, above all, the principled artist, Brady Corbet.
Cheers.
How'd it look up there?
It's very beautiful. It's a new print. It's extremely, extremely beautiful. I hope you like how it looked.
Did you like the movie? So, an inspired, uncompromising artist has to seek the patronage of a businessman to support his vision. With compromise lurking around every corner, what is this movie really about?
It's about every sadist I've ever worked with. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. My wife and I, we wrote it 7 years ago, and at the time we were pretty pissed off about an experience that we had just had, where making a movie. I'm sure there's many of you in this room that make movies, and it's complicated because you end up in bed with folks that have very, very different morals and ethics than you do to try to protect the flame of your project. And you try and put your project first, but in the process of putting your project first, you put everyone else in your life last, and that feels terrible. But it's very, very complicated. I mean, when I speak to CEOs that have they're like, oh, when we did our startup, it was the most stressful year of my life. So tough. And I'm like, yeah, but we do that every 18 months. Like we build a business with a new LLC every time we make a film. I mean, we hire 250 people every 18 months, and it's incredibly stressful. It's incredibly stressful. I mean, you get fatter and balder as a result of it, and I mean, it's just awful. It's so challenging, and there are moments which are rewarding, but I mean, very few compared to how many sleepless nights you have. I mean, honestly.
So, having been through this experience with Mona, what drew you to architecture and this architect and this particular story to kind of express some of the things that you were going through and also just explore what this particular individual went through?
I was just interested in how much people hate brutalism. Like, I mean, it's like people have like a real chip on their shoulder about it, and in Trump's first term, before we had like a little intermezzo, he had this mandate which was called "Make Federalist Buildings Beautiful Again," and it's interesting because I'm not sure if he knows who Albert Speer was, but he seems to fall right in line with these sort of like neo-fascist strongman tendencies to reject anything which is at all unfamiliar to them, and for me the artistic experience, the immigrant experience, is a very similar one. It's like, oh, the community is upset about a building that's been erected in town that's unfamiliar and strange. They want it torn down. Their new neighbor has a different tradition, different heritage, different skin color than they do, and they want them thrown out. And so, there's this kind of strange thing where when something is very new, everyone just fucking hates it, like for absolutely no reason. It's just like I hate it, but why? I mean, it's insane. It's totally insane. We should at least like pause for a moment and be like, maybe this is kind of interesting.
Can you talk a little bit about like what first attracted you to brutalism specifically? Was it that it was so kind of despised by some people, or is there something about the form? You make epic films yourself with sort of very powerful structures. Was there something about the form of brutalist architecture that also attracted you?
Yeah, I think it's the combination of minimalism and maximalism that I find really appealing. I mean, it's sort of, it's really, like it's not middle brow. Like it's very radical, and I like, I like music that's very dynamic. I like 4 bars of silence and then cacophony. I find that to be really, exciting. I mean, there's many gorgeous brutalist buildings and there's many ugly ones and as well, but it came about in the 1950s. And I mean, the seeds of it were in the Bauhaus, of course, in the 20s and 30s. But the first brutalist buildings and monuments were erected in the early 50s. And I think for us, we were thinking, okay, well, this is a very powerful visual allegory for post-war psychology and how post-war psychology and post-war architecture are intrinsically linked.
There's some big themes that connect the story of Laszlo Toth to America. I mean, we begin with that remarkable sequence when he's arriving there, and we see that very powerful image of the upside down Statue of Liberty, and then, of course, at the end of the movie, the upside down cross as well. So you have the art, the artist, you've got America, you've got religion. There's some massive themes here. And I wonder, as you're writing this film with Mona and as you're directing it as well, how are you kind of grappling these things and kind of wrestling them to the ground and making them really flow through the story? Because these are very large scale ideas that you're working with, and there's lots of different ways that I guess it could go awry. But you find a kind of a very strong thread through these big things.
Yeah, I grew up working in a bookstore, and I loved, novels of ideas. I loved Robert Musil and W.G. Sebald and V.S. Naipaul and I actually struggle with something as a viewer a lot, which is that I watch a lot of stuff that I actually think is like very handsomely, mounted and really well made. But it's like not really about anything at all. And it's like about a breakup, I'm like, I don't give a fuck. I don't give a fuck about who, like, what? Like, this is crazy. Like, you got 250 people together and you made a movie and it's about, like, that? Like, I mean, that's insane. Like, I know, I mean, but really, like, they're, these are actually not big ideas. They are the only ideas. This is what, this is what we're up against right now. I mean, we're dealing with radical conservatism, which is on the rise in every direction. You look east to Marine Le Pen in France, or south to Bolsonaro, who is once again maybe having a little intermezzo down in Brazil, and it is like, I mean, this is just the world that we live in, and I find it strange when something is not really wrestling with that. I mean, this is the social experiment that we're all sort of grappling with. Like, my wife is Norwegian, and and in Norway, which is a very successful utopian social experiment. If you look under the hood of the car, I mean, you still find capitalism because their number one export is oil. So it's very much at the expense of the world that they're all able to drive Teslas and shit. And it's like this sort of strange thing for me that no matter how much we try to defy it, like, we're all slaves to capitalism. And so I think that for me it's a real preoccupation of mine, because there's something very disturbing about that. That it's easier to imagine life after death than it is to imagine life after capitalism. And so I just sort of I mean, if anyone's got a better idea, raise their hand. But it's an interesting thing that it's something that fucks us all as individuals constantly. But like, we're all just too tired and worn out from the social experiment to really do anything about it either. And and films especially. I mean, we're really slaves to that precisely. I mean, like we have to find a patron that we hope wants to hang our art on their wall. but I mean, and without them, these projects, they don't exist. And there are some extraordinary people. I mean, this film, actually, we had really amazing partners. Like, we really genuinely did. People who really understood the film and really cared about it. But that's kind of rare, I would say.
The relationship between artist and patron in this film is so complex. There's so much going on. It's of course a relationship of power, and but also of envy and so many other different emotions. There is an exercise of sexual domination. There's all kinds of things going on, which are, I guess, wrapped up in exactly what you're talking about. That relationship of exerting will, one over the other. But Laszlo has something that his patron will never have, which is imagination, creative ability. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you wanted to explore in that particular dynamic. Let's set aside you as a filmmaker and all of that, but in the relationship between these two men, what was most interesting to you to kind of dig into?
The reason The Assault was set in Carrera, and one of the reasons it was so important to shoot there, is that Carrera represents something. I mean, Carrera marble, it lines our kitchens and bathrooms, and yet it is a material that in 500 years it'll be gone. That'll be it. And those mountains, those gorgeous, gorgeous mountains, will be like Swiss cheese, and it's gone. And for me, it's a place which is it's very, very beautiful, but we've taken a bite out of Mother Nature, and she's extremely pissed off. And there's constant rock slides, and people are constantly getting crushed by these stones and cutting their hands off and stuff in the process of extracting this material. And so for me, that whole sequence in the film is about a patron that's not, it's not satisfactory to possess this character's, body of work. He wants to possess him. And there's a real perversity, this thing of like wanting not just to collect the artist's body of work, but to collect the artist. And so and the whole film is, it's dialed up to very operatic extremes. It's a 1950s melodrama. I mean, like, look at a Nicholas Ray movie from the 50s. I mean, it's like, they're really, James Mason is like jacked. But I think that for me, I felt this sort of personal frustration, and my wife felt this way too, and we wrote this film as a sort of exorcism to sort of level the playing fields a little bit, and it's interesting because this film's success normally, and I really mean this, we don't really care. Like, we don't care if a film is successful. We care that it exists, and I think that with this one, it's a little different because if a 3.5-hour movie about mid-century design is successful, that's a game-changing metric for the entire independent film industry, and I really mean that. And it's not. And by the way, we're not patting ourselves on the back. I mean, we're very lucky that the film has been received the way that it's been received, which is sort of a combination of things. But if it actually performs the next time that somebody wants to shoot something on film or shoot it on large format film, and a line producer tells them that they can't, they'll say, "But we can, because we know we can. Because what about last year, or what about 3 months ago?" And I do that all the time. I point, Zone of Interest, a very radical movie. It made $52 million globally. I mean, that's a film that could have easily opened on 1 or 2 screens on both coasts. But A24, our great partner in the U.S., found a way to really mainstream that picture, and it made $8 or $9 million in the U.S., and it made $40 million globally, and so many people saw that movie, and so that's game changing. It's like, well, if clearly there is an audience for films that are really pushing the envelope. I mean, just period. So, I think that. I don't know. I think that's really significant. I'm not sure if everyone realizes how extraordinary it is that a film like that could succeed, but it really succeeded, and it made making a movie like ours a lot easier. And I hope that it makes next year a little easier for at least 2 or 3 people.
Can you talk a little bit about the cast that you put together for this film? And maybe let's start with Adrian Brody and why him for this role, what he brought to it. I understand his own family background is Hungarian as well, but can you talk a little bit about like what you wanted to have the actor bring to a role like Laszlo Toth?
Yeah, uh, Adrian's mother, Sylvia Plahi, who's an extraordinary photographer, she shot for the Village Voice for a long time. And Sylvia and her parents fled Hungary in 1956 during the revolution. And so, of course, this was like a particularly, particularly personal film for Adrian. But also just for practical reasons, he'd grown up speaking Hungarian, which is a notoriously difficult language, filled with a lot of aggressive sounds. Like, it's like it's like Cantonese. Like, it's really really tricky, and so it was an obvious choice. I was a little concerned that he would say no, because I was like, well, how many Hungarian Jewish performers that are between the age of 45 and 55 are there that can possibly do this, well? And so I was very, moved and relieved that he wanted to do it. And then the whole cast. I mean, they're all just like consummate professionals. I mean, just everyone. They showed up. They knew their lines. They understood the material. They cared. They were real pros. And that's not something I take for granted, because it's not always like that. And they just really gave a damn. And I think it shows. And we did our best to take care of them editorially and in every way to make sure that everyone put their best foot forward.
We're going to open it up soon to your questions. I have just one last thing for you, which is about the score for the film, which I think really mirrors the film's combination of being monumental and piercing at the same time. And this is Daniel Bloomberg. And can you talk a little bit about what you wanted from the score and what he brought to it?
Of course, yeah. On my previous films, I worked with an extraordinary artist named Scott Walker, who the film is dedicated to. And Scott, people are constantly asking me, like, who are your influences? And like, it's Scott Walker. Scott was my hero growing up. His approach to his work, and I mean, like, if you're not familiar with his work, you should seek it out, because he really was one of the most important artists of the 20th century and the 21st, as long as he spent in it. But when Scott passed away, it was, of course, like, huge shoes to fill. And Daniel had worked with my wife on her previous movie, but he also had a lot of people in common with Scott. He worked with the same co-producer, Pete Walsh, who I've worked with for 11 or 12 years on these scores. And so it was a very natural evolution, that to have this soft landing and finish the movie with a lot of the same faces and folks that I had made movies with and finished movies with in the past. But the difference between Daniel, who's only 30 years old, I mean, he's a very young guy. He's one of my best friends, and incredibly talented, but really, very, very young guy. And he really wanted to construct. It was important to him philosophically. I mean, we could have done live orchestral sessions, but he wanted to construct the soundtrack, and he was using a lot of open piano and prepared piano, which is when you take screws and manipulate the strings, or actually play the strings, with mallets. So you use the piano as a percussive instrument in that way. And if you record it properly, it sounds enormous, just because of the nature of a great piano's reverb. And and so he collaborated with a really diverse group of people like Vince Clarke from Depeche Mode and Erasure, who he worked with on the Moog synth version of the score for Venice in 1980. John Tilbury, who was sort of the most important interpreter of Morton Feldman and many John Cage records. So.
Thank you. All right, let's open it up. We've got some microphones on both sides. There's someone right in the front row center, conveniently enough, so we will go to you first.
So first off, I'd just like to thank you for the incredible movie. It was absolutely beautiful. And I think one of my favorite parts of it was just the cinematography. And I just wanted to know what the relationship was like working with your cinematographer, especially in like these really grand epic scenes versus the really like small scale intimate scenes.
My cinematographer is a guy named Lowell Crowley. We've worked together for 12 years. It's our third movie together. He's one of my best friends. He's like family. And he's a really visionary, very accomplished DP. And I told him I wanted to shoot the film on VistaVision because it was a format that was developed in the 1950s, so it felt like the best sort of way of accessing the period. And he's sort of like a child of Dogma 95 and like a lot of very kind of radical filmmaking that has sort of sadly been replaced by Amazon Prime. But yeah. So I have a real special affection for him, and he's it's interesting the job of a cinematographer because it's a very laborious job. I mean, making movies is not really a labor of love. It's just like labor. Like it is labor. And it's funny that it's represented in this sort of glamorous way, where there's red carpets and all of this nonsense. But it's like, but because what it actually is to make a film is it's just a lot of work. And he's a very hard worker, but he's got the eye and the spirit of a poet. So, I mean, he's my main squeeze.
Love it. All right, let's see. We've got lots of other questions here. Let's go over here. The arm up. Mike's on its way to you. Yeah, right there.
Hello. I had a question just about the architectural consulting on this film. I mean, we are architects, and this is probably one of the most accurate depictions of architecture that I've seen in film. And so I just wanted to know what it was like to work with, presumably, the consultant and how you captured this era of architecture so concisely.
We worked with a guy named Jean-Louis Cohen, who sadly passed away about a year and a half ago, a freak accident. But I love Jean-Louis very much. He taught architecture at Princeton, and that big Le Corbusier book that's from like Phaidon or Taschen that you see in rich people's living rooms. He wrote that book, and he also wrote an extraordinary book, this book Architecture in Uniform. And so he was a natural person to reach out to about this, and he lived in the IMP building, just like about a block north of Houston in New York. And I kind of, I brought him one question. I was like, can you give me a single example of someone who got stuck in the quagmire of the war that was able to restart or revamp their career with a firm in the 1950s? And Jean-Louis was like, he's like Google, he's like Wikipedia, like, came to life. And immediately he said, no, didn't happen. And it was devastating. We speak so much about the lives lost, and that's, of course, I mean, there's nothing bigger than that. But there are the livelihoods that were lost as well. And we lost so much work, and we lost so much talent. And when we went through the archives from the Bauhaus, it was extremely moving because there were so many unrealized projects, and it was just like masterpiece after masterpiece after masterpiece after masterpiece. And these fuckers like took it away from us, and like from the there were so many just visionary projects. And so I felt when my production designer, Judy, and I sat down that we should, at least start there. Like, is there a way for us to sort of, pay homage, reference to these unrealized projects out of the Bauhaus? So yeah, Jean-Louis was fantastic, and I miss him very much. I mean, truly, like one of the biggest brains I've ever encountered. And then my production designer, Judy, she's just excellent. She's done many iconic American movies like Brokeback Mountain and Carol, and she just knows what's up, and she knows how to work on it with a small budget. And the one thing is like, if this film had been about a more ornamental style of architecture, we wouldn't have been able to make it for $10 million.
Are you okay telling people what the budget of your film was?
It was $10 million.
Can you believe that?
It was $10 million. It was shot in 33 days, and which for those of you that have context is fast. And but honestly, if we'd had more money, it would have been I really mean this. It would have been the same film. We would have had a much more peaceful time making it. And so I'm just I'm mentally and spiritually just so exhausted after so many years of not making any money at all, and not having to work abroad because we couldn't afford to work here, and being away from my daughter who's 10, and like it was actually really difficult, and having a little bit more money would have meant that for myself and about 15 other people that made $0 making the film, that they just would have been able to like make a living wage. Having a little more money, that's all it would have really affected. And so yes, it's a small budget considering how big the film is, but the reality is that $10 million is a lot of money. And if you have a team that knows what they're doing and a line producer that's not a total doofus, like, you can figure it out.
And you did. All right, we've got time for just a couple more questions. Let's go back here on the aisle.
Thank you, Mr. Corbet. Great movie. How much trust do you have your actors to convey the tone and the message you want to bring to the film in each scene, as opposed to how much direction you give? Because it seems there's an incredibly amount of subtlety in each scene and each character. And as an actor yourself, you take liberties. I'm just curious to know how much direction versus how much trust you have to the actors. I
mean, this group of people, they kind of really just like understood the assignment, and I wish I could take responsibility for what they did, but I mean, beyond choosing takes and trying to create like a shape to a performance editorially, I don't really have much to do with that. We're very specific in the screenplays. Very, very specific. I've sort of figured out a format that conveys where the camera is in relationship to the performer. Long lens on, ultra wide on, like everybody that reads the script, they kind of know what the scene looks like. And so I think we try to give people so many instructions in the script that they're usually kind of there. It's very, very rare that someone is like in a different movie. And then also it's we don't do very many setups. Most scenes are 2 setups, sometimes 3. I mean, I get very anxious if there's more than 2, and I try to keep everything to 1 if it's possible. And but that means that you're not wasting a lot of time setting up a camera, and you're able to do 20 to 30 takes of something, so people really get that sense memory and that choreography and stuff, like really in their bones.
Thank you. Okay, last question. We will go.
Make it controversial.
Oh, you shouldn't have said that. All right, let's go in the center right here. Just wait for the microphone, please. Yeah, you. Is there a mic on its way? Okay, it's going to be
I can't see anything at all.
right here. It's going to be passed from one to the next, and it is there.
All right. Thank you, Brady, for coming out here and making the time. My question is, in the second half, a lot of people in Laszlo's family moved to Israel, and I'm curious, why do you think Laszlo stayed in America?
Well, at the end of the film, he decides to leave. Actually, I mean, he perhaps continued to work in America, but for me, it's just about the fact that every film about the American dream, is about like how people finally make it work, and I really wanted to make a film about the American myth and the American dream where it doesn't work and they have to leave. I mean, it's really as simple as that. And the end of the film has been interpreted in a variety of different ways, but the truth is that, so much of what it's exploring is, these characters that are looking for somewhere to belong, and then they realize, you know what? Like, this just doesn't work for us. Like, we got to get the hell out of here. And the food sucks. Which is, I mean, especially circa 1950, like, pretty accurate. I mean, like, I don't know how many, like, Jell-O puddings or whatever, like, anyone can stomach before being like, we got to get the hell out. We're going to start a new life somewhere else. I think that, for me, this is a film, the first part of the movie is called The Enigma of Arrival, which is, it takes its name from a memoir written by V.S. Naipaul about when he emigrated from Trinidad to the UK. And it's one of my favorite books. It's an extraordinary novel, and it's kind of nonfiction, but also not in the way that Sebald is, and so for me, this is a film. I mean, these characters were written to their circumstance because it was predominantly Eastern and Central European Jews that were at the Bauhaus in the 20s and 30s before the Nazis shut it down. But for me, it's just about immigration, full stop. For me personally, I'm colorblind. I also don't have a dog in the race. I grew up in a Catholic school, with nuns, and my family, distantly is Hungarian. They're a mix of Hungarian Jews, but also Christians, and for me, that's just not what this movie is about. The artists, they tend to worship at the altar of themselves. They don't. It's very, very rare that I meet someone who's extremely religious because there's just not enough room for you and a deity. If you are making something, and so and the deity doesn't do anything for you at all. Like you're just if anything you resent the deity. So I think that I'm very interested in the ways in which we use religion to fill the secular void in the middle of the century, the end of the century. I'm interested in that as it relates to occultism, astrology, Christianity, and so I try to approach with really no judgment and with a degree of accuracy, and we really wanted to get everything absolutely right. But for me, this character, and I said to Adrian, I was like, every time you're in the synagogue, it's important that you look pretty bored. Like, you just have to look like, all right, I need this guy to help me find, like, my wife. And I was like, and you're just there. And if you rewatch the movie, you'll see he's kind of like, he's got 1 foot in and 1 foot out, and then he occasionally goes to synagogue at High Holiday. You know, he's a bad Jew. I'm a bad everything. All right. Thank you for coming.
Brady Corbet.
We're very grateful. I know the movie's long and this Q&A was longer, so thanks.